Good morning, my neighbors!
Ladies and gents, it's Thursday. George Clooney is asking his friend Joe Biden to step down. Meanwhile, privatised water company Thames Water are asking you to cough up. It's time for an alternative paper review. But first up to the shocking and brutal murder of a mother and her two daughters in Bushey, Hertfordshire yesterday. This is a story that the wife and children of the BBC sports commentator John Hunt were savagely executed yesterday before the suspect went on the run in Enfield. Now, we can't even begin to imagine the sort of pain and confusion that Mr. Hunt must be going through at the moment. But what we usually do on these paper reviews anyway is kind of look at the media reaction to stories, right? And I'm sorry to say, I think what you're going to see is predictably a lot of talk of, quote, evil. A lot of talk about senseless violence, a lot of focus on the perpetrator or alleged perpetrator because of two reasons, really. The first is that is the simplistic language that makes sense to the masses. You know, like, oh, evil, bad. Right, okay, I understand these words. That makes sense. That's why he did these things. But secondly, because it allows us to just box it up and wrap a little bow around it and say that nobody could have predicted it, let alone prevented it. And so now I guess that's me and wider society off the hook, and we can all go back to wanking over Kardashians and babbling about Strictly. You know, he was evil, which means he was born evil. He was some sort of demon subhuman type creature, and I'm not a subhuman type creature. You know, and what are you going to do about that? There's nothing you can do. You can't tame lions into being house cats, and you can't socialise demons. I can't stress that enough. As ever, I suppose the closest thing to a solution that we have to incidents and issues like this is to hugely ramp up investment in things like consent and gender studies. But unfortunately for these women, and, you know, realistically, probably a few more next week, next month, over the space of the next year, we've just lived through 14 years of a Tory government who, whenever you talked about things like gender studies, they would just dismiss and denigrate as though all of that was wrapped up in inclusivity, diversity, and woke. Anyway, I suppose we can take some small modicum of solace in the knowledge that they have apprehended the alleged killer, and he's probably going to prison for a very long time. Prisons that The Guardian and Keir Starmer are saying are in a worse state than anyone had feared. Really? Really, Keir? Prisons are in a worse state than you had feared? Worse than overpacked, over 100% capacity crumbling Victorian jails? Worse than inmates going on the run for 2 weeks before they're apprehended? Worse than underpaid prison staff banging the convicts? I gotta tell you, prisons are much worse than I had feared. Like, how? How is it? Is it all of that and it's in Clacton? That's what it is. Is it like prisons are over capacity and you've got convicts going on the run and you've got prison staff bagging other convicts and it's in Clacton and you've got Peter Kay testing out new material in the prisons? I mean, if ever there was gonna be a deterrent. But anyway, yes, this looks set to be the first crisis of Keir Starmer's premiership. One where a portfolio of crumbling Victorian jails are on the brink of collapse and where Labour are being forced to continue that wonderful Tory idea of just releasing violent offenders early, you know, to just ease up a bit of space. You know, that is legitimately what we're doing, right? When you consider we're only really jailing actual violent offenders, people who might be a threat to the public, right? And now we're letting them out when it's like 40% time served. So what sort of trade is going on here? You're going to end up in a situation where it's like, oh, you're the crossbow killer, are you? How many did you get? You killed 3 women. 3? Right, okay. How many did you kill? You punched your wife in the head and she died. Right, okay, well, crossbow's probably worse, isn't it? Why don't you two switch places? Why are you pushing me to sell, man? I didn't have a phone call yet. I didn't get to say goodbye to me mum out there. And they'll be like, oh, don't worry about it. Yeah, don't worry. You'll be out before you know it. Yeah, time flies when you're having fun. You see her? She's going to suck you off in a minute. Of course, the sad truth with the UK prison system is that nobody wants to allocate funding to it. But it is also true that the failing UK prison sector is just a symptom of broader UK state failures. And not to make everything sort of party political, but, prisons are basically the expensive, fiscally reckless output endgame to conservative ideology. They really are. Because here's what happens, right, is you could allocate funding, a few billion, to youth clubs, to skate parks, to recording studios, facilities, services that keep young people busy or distracted from drugs and a life of crime. You could ramp up the social worker sector so that single mothers on council estates had a little bit of support and they didn't feel so overwhelmed all the time, right? Or you could allocate some funding to private tuition for their children so it allowed them to flourish and succeed and escape that environment of deprivation from which they started. You could stimulate social mobility all over again, and these kids would then grow up to be something else than the criminals of tomorrow. But in the absence of those facilities and services, what happens? The kids fall through the cracks, they land in gangs, they end up traumatised by family violence, and ultimately they end up in police cells, or on probation, or in prisons, right? And then a situation where you could have allocated a social worker to their house for like 2 hours on minimum wage, right? That's how much that would have cost you back 14 years ago. Now, you've got to house this guy for 24 hours a day. You've got to build whole new prisons to contain the people that you neglected from 14 years ago. Austerity savings then have turned out to be just ballooning deferred expense, in fact, borrowing for today. If you'd spent a little bit of money back then, you'd have fewer criminals today. Criminals cost more to house and feed and clothe and keep warm. This shit is not complicated. So yeah, congratulations once again to the Conservative Party of the last 14 years. You shut a few youth centres in 2012. How much did that save you? 30 million. Great. Did it reduce the national debt by anything? No, actually it went up. Oh, well, wonderful. How many prisons do you think you could build now for 30 million pounds? Absolutely zero. Well, fucking wonderful. Great job all round. What's your solution to all of this? I can hear you screaming in the comments section. Well, I remain resolute in my commitment to put all of those convicted of political corruption on the Bibi Stockholm or fly them off to Rwanda. And in addition to that, the panic construction of 100 new nightingales.